The gates were never locked. They were simply forgotten. For centuries, this place was meant to be seen only by emperors, courtiers, and ghosts of protocol. Now, birds nest where ministers once bowed, and silence sits on a throne that no longer exists. Japan is known for preservation, for reverence, for ritual. But hidden in the ancient heart of Nara lies an imperial estate the country quietly stepped away from. Not destroyed, not sold, just left behind. The Nara Palace estate was never meant to fade. It was conceived as permanence, as a symbol that power, once earned, could outlive flesh. In the 8th century, when Nara was the capital of Japan, this land was the axis of the nation. Every road, every decree, every prayer radiated from here. The emperor lived not in isolation, but in ceremony. Each step measured, each room designed to reinforce order. The palace complex stretched wider than many modern cities of its time. More than 1,000 buildings once stood within its boundaries, painted vermilion, roofed with tile, aligned with the cosmos itself. One surprising fact often overlooked: the palace was designed using strict Chinese geomancy, aligning mountains, rivers, and even prevailing winds to ensure divine legitimacy. Power here was architectural. But power in Japan has always been fragile, not because of rebellion, but because of belief. The imperial court believed misfortune could cling to places, that tragedy could stain wood and stone. And when bad omens accumulated, the only solution was abandonment. And omens did come. Fires swept through the palace again and again. Lightning struck ceremonial halls. Plagues rippled through the capital. In one recorded year, nearly 1/3 of Nara's population died. Whispers began. Not loud ones, polite ones, the most dangerous kind. By the end of the 8th century, the decision was made. The capital would move. First briefly, then permanently. Kyoto rose. Nara emptied. What followed was not destruction, but erasure by neglect. Buildings were dismantled piece by piece. Wood repurposed. Tiles reused. What couldn't be moved was allowed to return to earth. Within decades, rice fields covered throne rooms. Farmers plowed through corridors where emperors once processed in silk. Children played where state rituals once determined the fate of provinces. Another surprising truth. For over 1,000 years, most Japanese had no idea the imperial palace of Nara even existed beneath their feet. It wasn't rediscovered until the 20th century. Accidentally. During construction, foundations emerged. Post holes, roof tiles stamped with imperial insignia. History, buried but intact. Archaeologists realized something unsettling. This wasn't ruin. It was deliberate forgetting. Even after rediscovery, Japan made a strange choice. They did not rebuild the palace in full. They reconstructed only fragments. A gate, a hall, just enough to suggest what was lost. The rest was left open, empty, exposed to wind and rain. Why? Because the imperial household never returned. Unlike castles reclaimed as museums, this estate remains in a quiet limbo. Too sacred to commercialize, too politically delicate to romanticize, and too large to restore without rewriting history. Visitors today walk across vast grass plains, unaware they are standing on the center of a former empire. There are no guards, no velvet ropes, only subtle markers in the ground. And yet, something lingers. Local residents still avoid certain sections after sunset. Not out of superstition, they insist. Out of respect. One mid-level court official once wrote that the palace did not like to be watched when empty. A strange sentence, even stranger that it survived in records. The estate breathes differently at night. Wind moves without echo. Footsteps feel delayed. This is not a haunted place in the Western sense. No apparitions, no screams. It is something quieter. A space built entirely for power, suddenly deprived of it. And here is the unsettling cliffhanger. Despite all this history, despite its rediscovery, despite its national importance, there is one section of the Nara Palace estate that remains unexcavated, untouched, and officially unexplained. Not because they can't dig, but because they won't. They call it preservation. But sometimes preservation is just a softer word for fear. The unexcavated section sits slightly higher than the rest of the estate, a gentle rise in the land, almost unnoticeable unless you're looking for it. Official maps mark it as protected terrain. Unofficially, it is known as a place that complicates answers. When archaeologists first proposed a full excavation, the resistance did not come from locals. It came from Tokyo, from ministries that rarely comment on soil and grass. The reason given was ritual sensitivity. The emperor, even today, is not considered merely symbolic. He is tied to continuity, to lineage, and to places that still carry spiritual weight. One surprising fact rarely discussed outside academic circles. Certain imperial sites are believed to retain residual authority, not spiritual energy, authority, as if power leaves an imprint the way heat does. Excavating such places is not illegal. It is simply discouraged. And discouraged in Japan often means forbidden. The palace estate became a test case for a broader question the country has never fully answered. What happens when modern identity collides with sacred history? In the years after World War II, Japan rebuilt aggressively. Cities rose. Ruins disappeared. But imperial spaces were treated differently. They were not restored. They were not erased. They were paused. Nara became a living contradiction. A place where the nation's oldest centralized authority lay open to the sky, but carefully untouched at its core. Another surprising detail. Ground-penetrating radar has already mapped much of the unexcavated zone. Officials know what is there. They just won't say it publicly. Privately, researchers describe a structure larger than expected. Deeper foundations. Unusual orientation. Not aligned with the main ceremonial axis. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the most important building in the estate was never the throne hall? Ancient records mention a rear precinct, a space separate from public ritual. Rarely described. Almost never named. Some historians believe it was used for succession rites. Others think it housed regalia never meant to be seen. Objects that symbolized legitimacy, not governance. And legitimacy, once questioned, is dangerous. Midway through the 20th century, one excavation proposal came closer than any other. Funding was approved. Teams assembled. Equipment staged. Then, days before digging was set to begin, the project was quietly canceled. No press conference. No explanation. One member of the team later said the cancellation notice was handwritten, not typed, and included a single line that has never been officially confirmed. This area has already served its purpose. That sentence unsettled people far beyond archaeology, because it suggested the site was not merely old. It was complete. As if history itself had decided nothing more should be taken from it. Meanwhile, the rest of the estate continued its strange half-life. School trips passed through reconstructed gates. Tourists took photos of emptiness. Drones were banned without explanation. Grass grew. Seasons turned. The palace did not demand attention. It waited. There is a pattern here, one seen across Japanese history. When power becomes unstable, it relocates. When meaning becomes dangerous, it hides. The imperial court left Nara to escape omens. Modern Japan leaves part of Nara untouched to avoid questions. Questions like, what defines authority when tradition outlives belief? What happens when symbols are older than the people interpreting them? One quiet revelation emerged from carbon dating in the 1990s. Some wooden remnants beneath the soil predate the official founding of the palace, which means the site was important before it was imperial. That detail changes everything. It suggests the emperor did not choose this land. The land chose the emperor. And if that is true, then abandonment was not a loss of relevance. It was a withdrawal, as if the site had given enough. As night falls over the estate today, the open fields darken uniformly. But that raised section holds shadow longer. Light fades there first, and returns last. Visitors rarely notice, but surveyors do. And so do the officials who keep saying no. Because once you excavate the center, you can no longer pretend the edges tell the whole story. And Japan, a nation built on continuity, is not always ready to hear what its foundations might say. There is a moment in every long abandoned place when it stops feeling historical and starts feeling intentional. For the Nara Palace estate, that moment comes when you realize how carefully the emptiness has been maintained. This is not wilderness reclaiming ruins. This is restraint. Grass is trimmed. Sight lines are preserved. Nothing grows tall enough to block the horizon. It resembles a memory that refuses to blur. In the decades after its rediscovery, scholars noticed something unsettling. While outer structures were documented in obsessive detail, references to inner functions were vague, almost evasive. Court diaries described ceremonies without outcomes, rituals without explanation. Pages where ink density suddenly thinned as if the writer hesitated. One surprising fact stands out. The official chronicles of the era record the dates of palace fires precisely. But when it comes to what was lost in those fires, the records go silent. No inventories. No lists. Just acknowledgments that something burned. In a culture that documented everything, omission is never accidental. The more historians studied Nara, the more it became clear that this palace was not simply a residence. It was a filter. Foreign ideas entered Japan through Nara. Buddhism, administrative law, urban planning, all passed through this estate before spreading outward. And with them came anxiety. The court feared dilution, that too much outside influence could weaken divine lineage. So they built boundaries within boundaries. Outer halls for governance, inner precincts for continuity, and somewhere deeper still, a space meant to protect the idea of rule itself. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Some scholars believe the unexcavated area may contain early succession records that contradict later imperial narratives. Not scandals, not conspiracies, just complexity, lineage disputes, adoptions, moments when continuity required adjustment. Nothing destabilizes a myth faster than nuance. Another overlooked detail. Unlike later imperial compounds, Nara's palace had no permanent sleeping quarters for the emperor. Residences were temporary, ceremonial, which suggests the emperor was never meant to stay long. The palace was not a home. It was a process, and processes end. By the time the capital moved, the court framed it as pragmatism. But internal correspondence hints at relief, as if leaving Nara closed a chapter that had grown heavy. Centuries later, modern Japan inherited that weight without the context. After the war, as the nation redefined itself, imperial symbolism became delicate terrain. The emperor remained, but interpretation narrowed. Past was curated, smooth, unthreatening. Nara didn't fit. It was too early, too raw, too close to the moment when authority was still being negotiated. So it stayed open, literally and metaphorically. No walls, no narrative closure. Visitors often describe the estate as peaceful. But peace is not the same as resolution. There is a tension here that never releases, a sense that something was paused mid-sentence. In 2010, a proposal surfaced to digitally reconstruct the entire palace using existing data. No digging. No disturbance. Even that was declined. The concern wasn't accuracy. It was implication. Because a complete reconstruction would force a complete explanation. And explanations invite questions. Like why the most sacred site in early Japan was allowed to dissolve into farmland. Why rediscovery was followed by restraint instead of celebration. Why silence became policy. One retired official, speaking anonymously, described the estate as a mirror that reflects differently depending on who looks. For some, it is a cradle of civilization. For others, a warning. Because Nara shows that power does not always collapse. Sometimes it simply steps aside. And when it does, it leaves behind places that are neither ruins nor monuments. Just spaces where history stops speaking aloud. Here is the cliffhanger that still troubles scholars. If the unexcavated core was truly central, if it held the mechanisms of legitimacy, then abandoning it was not an accident. It was a decision. And that decision suggests the early court understood something modern Japan still struggles with. That authority survives not by exposure, but by knowing when to disappear. Disappearance is not the same as loss. In Japan, it is often a strategy. The Nara Palace estate teaches this quietly, by refusing to explain itself, by remaining open, yet incomplete. What makes this estate unusual is not what is missing. It is what was allowed to remain. Unlike castles torn down to erase rival clans, Nara was never punished. There was no decree of disgrace, no official condemnation. The court simply left. And in doing so, they set a precedent that would repeat across Japanese history. Power relocates. Symbols rest. Meaning hibernates. One surprising historical parallel is rarely mentioned. Several Shinto shrines are ritually rebuilt every 20 years, only to be dismantled again. The structure is temporary. The tradition is permanent. Nara follows the same logic, just stretched across centuries. The palace did not need to stand to remain influential. Its absence became part of the system. This becomes clearer when you examine how later capitals were designed. Kyoto learned from Nara's mistakes. It tucked authority behind layers, limited visibility, controlled access. Nara had been too open, too legible. Its vast courtyards invited observation. Its rituals were visible. Its order could be mapped. And anything that can be mapped can be challenged. Modern preservationists face an uncomfortable question here. By keeping Nara open, are they honoring history? Or perpetuating its unresolved tensions? In the 1980s, local planners suggested introducing more signage, context panels, narrative pathways. The proposal was rejected. The official reason cited aesthetic restraint. The unofficial reason was more revealing. Too much explanation would fix meaning, and meaning in this case was not meant to be fixed. Another overlooked fact. The estate is technically managed not by a museum authority, but by a cultural agency with direct ties to imperial affairs. This administrative choice matters. It keeps interpretation cautious, language neutral, emotion restrained. The land speaks. The state listens carefully. Walking the estate today, there is a peculiar sense of balance. Nothing pulls you in one direction. Nothing tells you how to feel. This is intentional. The palace once organized the nation. Now it refuses to organize memory. And that refusal is powerful. There is a moment at dusk when the reconstructed gate casts a long shadow across the grass. It stretches toward the unexcavated rise, never quite reaching it. Some see this as coincidence. Others see it as alignment. Because even the fragments seem aware of what they are not allowed to touch. The most telling silence, however, comes from education. Japanese textbooks mention Nara as a former capital. They describe reforms. They list dates. But they do not dwell on the palace. No emotional framing. No dramatic emphasis. As if the place is acknowledged but not engaged. This selective distance shapes collective memory. Nara becomes background, a prelude, not a climax, which is ironic. Because without Nara, there is no imperial continuity to preserve. This is where the emotional weight lands. The estate represents the moment Japan learned that power must sometimes retreat to endure. That permanence can be dangerous. That visibility invites erosion. By leaving Nara incomplete, the nation preserved its flexibility. But that choice comes at a cost. Unresolved places, ask unresolved questions. And those questions wait patiently. Here is the quiet cliffhanger. As generations pass, fewer people remember why certain areas are untouched. Ritual restraint becomes habit. Habit becomes rule. And eventually no one remembers who decided or why. When that happens, what was once protection becomes inertia. And inertia is fragile. Inertia does not announce itself. It settles in slowly. Like dust on a floor no one is quite sure they're allowed to sweep. The Nara Palace estate exists in that state now. Not endangered. Not celebrated. Simply maintained. But maintenance is not memory. The caretakers who mow the grass today are not priests. They are not historians. They are workers following schedules designed decades ago, based on decisions made by people long gone. And that distance matters. Because when meaning is inherited without explanation, it becomes fragile. A rule followed without reason lasts only as long as it goes unquestioned. In recent years, Japan has faced a quiet shift. Rural populations are shrinking. Budgets are tightening. Cultural priorities are being reassessed. And for the first time since its rediscovery, Nara's quiet protection has been discussed pragmatically. One surprising detail emerged from a closed-door planning session. Officials debated whether the open land could be partially repurposed for community integration, walking paths, event spaces, subtle uses. Nothing dramatic, nothing disrespectful, just use. The proposal didn't pass, but it was discussed. That alone marks a change. Because for centuries, Nara was avoided not because it lacked value, but because its value was undefined. Undefined things are powerful, but they are also vulnerable. Younger generations visit the estate differently. They jog. They picnic. Out. They photograph sunsets. To them it is a beautiful emptiness. A green space in a crowded world. And that is not wrong. But it is incomplete. The palace was once the most intentional space in the nation. Every measurement symbolic. Every orientation deliberate. Now it risks becoming accidental. Historians worry about this quietly. Not because the past must dominate the present, but because forgetting why restraint existed invites careless reinterpretation. One scholar put it bluntly: if we normalize the silence without understanding it, we lose the ability to choose differently. That statement never made it into official reports. There is another fact rarely shared. In the 1970s, soil samples taken near the unexcavated rise revealed unusually dense layering. Multiple phases of construction. Multiple rebuilds. Which means whatever stood there mattered enough to be replaced repeatedly. And yet no surviving text describes it clearly. That absence is not a gap. It is a boundary. The early court understood something modern systems often forget. That not everything meaningful benefits from exposure. That some truths stabilize a culture best when they remain implied. Nara embodied that philosophy. But philosophies require renewal. Without conscious remembrance, restraint becomes superstition. And superstition eventually invites rebellion. This is the tension now. Should Nara remain a question mark? Or should it be finally resolved? Resolution brings clarity. But it also collapses possibilities. Once you name what was there, you decide what it means. And once meaning is fixed, it can no longer adapt. Perhaps that is why the palace was never rebuilt in full. Reconstruction would have frozen it in one interpretation. Leaving it open keeps it alive. Not alive as architecture, but alive as dialogue. The estate asks something of each generation. Not to answer it, but to decide whether answering is necessary. As long as that choice remains deliberate, Nara functions as intended. But when the choice becomes automatic, when silence is maintained only because it always has been, the balance shifts. Here is the final tension of this chapter. The palace was abandoned to protect continuity. Its rediscovery was handled to preserve ambiguity. But ambiguity is not infinite. At some point, the nation must either reaffirm why this place remains incomplete, or accept that incompleteness will be filled by convenience. And convenience is rarely careful. The grass will still grow. The paths will still curve. The raised ground will still cast its longer shadow. But whether those features remain meaningful, or merely scenic, that decision has not yet been made. Every generation inherits silence differently. For the court that left Nara, silence was relief. For those who rediscovered it, silence was caution. For those walking its fields today, silence is atmosphere. And atmosphere is easily mistaken for intention. The palace estate now sits at the intersection of three forces: heritage, utility, and time. Time is the least patient of them all. Japan's population is aging. Institutions are consolidating. Cultural funding is increasingly asked to justify itself. In that environment, places that do not explain their value are quietly scrutinized. Not aggressively, politely. The most Japanese way possible. Committees form. Language softens. Questions are phrased as suggestions. What role does this land serve today? How does it engage the public? What outcomes does it provide? These are modern questions. Nara was never built to answer them. Another surprising fact rarely mentioned outside policy circles: the estate's protected status must be periodically renewed. It is not permanent. Each renewal is procedural, routine, until it isn't. So far, renewal has always passed. But each time, the vote margin narrows slightly. Not because anyone wants to disturb the site, but because fewer people feel confident defending what they cannot articulate. Meaning fades when it isn't spoken. And Nara has been quiet for a very long time. There is a subtle shift happening among scholars as well. A newer generation is less inclined toward reverence by default. They ask harder questions. They challenge inherited restraint, not out of disrespect, out of curiosity. If palace mattered so much, why protect it through absence instead of explanation? If ambiguity was once useful, is it still? These are not dangerous questions, but they are destabilizing ones, because they threaten to move Nara from sacred pause into active debate. And debate changes things. Once discussed openly, the unexcavated core becomes a problem to solve instead of a boundary to respect. That transformation is already beginning. Recent academic papers refer to the area not as restricted but as understudied. A small linguistic shift, but a powerful one. Understudied implies future action. The land itself does not respond. It remains grass, soil, wind diked, but the story around it is stirring. Here's the paradox Nara presents. The palace was abandoned to preserve legitimacy. But in doing so, it left behind a legitimacy that cannot explain itself. For centuries, that was acceptable. The myth carried the weight. In the modern world, myths are audited. Transparency is valued. Context demanded. Silence interpreted as absence rather than depth. This is where the emotional core of Nara resides. It is not a tragedy. It is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a test. Can a culture allow something foundational to remain unresolved and still trust itself? Or must every origin be clarified, categorized, and displayed? The early court believed restraint was strength, that stepping back preserved continuity. Modern systems believe articulation is strength, that clarity prevents misuse. Both are reasonable. They simply cannot coexist forever. As dusk settles again over the estate, the open fields glow briefly before dark. The raised ground absorbs the light and releases it slowly. No signs explain this. No guides narrate it. It happens whether watched or not. And perhaps that is the point Nara has been making all along. That some centers do not need to be entered to function. That some foundations hold precisely because they are not exposed. But foundations, once questioned, must eventually answer. And when they do, the story changes. Change rarely arrives loudly in places like this. It comes as paperwork, as wording revisions, as meetings where no one raises their voice. That is how Nara will change, if it ever does. There will be no dramatic announcement, no public debate framed as controversy, just a shift in how the estate is described. Already, brochures speak less of the palace and more of the park, less of authority and more of landscape. Words are choosing sides. One surprising fact underscores how fragile this balance is. Less than 10% of the original palace layout has been physically reconstructed. The rest exists only as outlines in the soil, which means most visitors are not seeing history. They are imagining it. Imagination is powerful, but it is also unstable. As collective imagination shifts, so does meaning. For some, Nara is becoming a symbol of early statehood. For others, a lesson in impermanence. For many, simply a quiet place to breathe. All of these readings are valid, but none are complete, because the palace was not built to be reflective. It was built to be directive. Its purpose was to tell people where they stood. In the world. In the hierarchy. In time. That function has dissolved. And when directive spaces lose authority, they become interpretive ones. This is where the risk lies. Interpretation invites projection. Already, fringe theories circulate online. Speculation about hidden chambers. About lost regalia. About secrets buried to protect modern narratives. Most of it is nonsense. But nonsense thrives in silence. If the core remains unexcavated without explanation, others will explain it for them. History abhors a vacuum almost as much as power does. The irony is that the very restraint meant to protect continuity now exposes it to distortion. One internal report acknowledged this quietly. It warned that prolonged ambiguity could invite uncontrolled narrative formation. A bureaucratic phrase, but a revealing one. It means the story may escape its custodians. At the same time, excavation carries its own danger. Digging would not just reveal structures. It would impose interpretation. Whatever is found would be named, categorized, positioned within a timeline. And timelines imply progression. Progression suggests improvement, which risks framing the abandonment as correction rather than choice. That would rewrite the emotional logic of early Japan. Because leaving Nara was not about failure. It was about adaptation. A nuance easily lost once artifacts replace absence. This is why the decision remains unresolved. Not because of fear of what might be found, but because of fear of what finding it would force people to believe. Every culture chooses which silences to keep. Japan chose Nara. But choices are not static. They must be renewed or they dissolve. There is a moment coming. Not dramatic, not imminent, but inevitable. A generation will rise that does not remember why this place was left open. They will inherit the site without the instinctive restraint. To them, restraint will look like neglect. And neglect demands correction. That correction may be respectful, careful, even well-intentioned, but it will still be a break. And once broken, Nara will become something else. Not a question, not a pause, but an answer. The most telling detail of all is this. Despite decades of study, no single official narrative of the Nara Palace estate exists. No definitive guidebook. No sanctioned story. Only fragments. That absence is not oversight. It is design. But design, like authority, only works when recognized. As the sun sets again over the grass, the estate does not resist the future. It does not signal warning. It simply waits. Waiting has worked before. Whether it will work again depends on who decides next. Waiting is a form of trust. The Nara Palace estate has trusted time for more than 1,000 years. Trusted that restraint would be understood. Trusted that silence would be respected. That trust has not been blind. It has been managed, renewed quietly, protected through custom rather than decree. But time has changed the audience. The people who once understood unspoken boundaries are gone. What remains is a space asking to be interpreted by those who did not inherit its context. This is the danger of longevity. Survival outlasting explanation. In the past, Nara's emptiness was meaningful because everyone knew why it existed. Now, fewer do. One surprising fact reveals how fragile this balance has become. Recent visitor surveys show that a majority of first-time visitors do not realize they are walking through the former center of Imperial power. They think it is simply an ancient park, a beautiful one, but nothing more. This is not ignorance. It is a consequence of design. The estate does not assert itself. It does not demand recognition. And in a world trained to respond to signals, what does not speak is easily overlooked. Yet history does not disappear just because it goes unnoticed. It waits. Like sediment. Like pressure. The Nara Palace estate holds layers of decision-making within it. The choice to build. The choice to leave. The choice to rediscover. The choice not to fully explain. Each layer reflects a different Japan. A different understanding of power. The earliest Japan believed authority was cosmically anchored. Later Japan believed authority was ritually maintained. Modern Japan believes authority must be socially justified. Nara fits perfectly into the first two. It strains against the third. That strain is quiet, but constant. Every time a proposal is reviewed. Every time funding is reassessed. Every time a question is asked and answered with tradition instead of reason. Tradition, without renewal, hardens. And hardened tradition invites fracture. Some argue that excavation would not destroy Nara's meaning, but update it. That clarity could strengthen respect rather than weaken it. Others argue the opposite, that the power of Nara lies precisely in its refusal to resolve. Both sides are right, and that is the problem. The palace estate is not a relic waiting to be completed. It is a mechanism that only works if left unfinished. Once finished, it becomes static, a museum piece. And museums, for all their value, freeze stories. Nara has survived because it stayed fluid, open enough to walk, closed enough to wonder. But fluid systems require active stewardship, not maintenance alone, but intention. The question facing Japan is not whether Nara should change. Change is inevitable. The question is whether that change will be conscious. Because unconscious change is erosion. And erosion does not preserve meaning. It flattens it. If Nara becomes just another park, something rare is lost. Not a building. Not an artifact. But an example of restraint as governance. A reminder that power does not always announce itself. That sometimes the strongest statement is withdrawal. This is not nostalgia. It is strategy. The early court understood that authority survives by relocating when necessary, by avoiding overexposure, by allowing space for reinterpretation. Nara was that space. It absorbed the weight of beginnings so later, eras could move forward unburdened. That is why it was left open. Why it remains incomplete. But incompleteness requires guardians, not guards, not fences. Guardians of meaning. As the estate stands today, that guardianship is thinning. Not from malice, from distance. Distance between modern lives and ancient logic. Between policy language and ritual instinct. If that distance grows too wide, the estate will still exist physically. But its function will vanish. Once function disappears, form becomes decoration. The grass will still wave. The paths will still curve. The raised ground will still hold its shadow. But the silence will mean nothing. And that would be the true abandonment. Not leaving the palace behind, but leaving behind the understanding of why it was left. Understanding does not vanish all at once. It thins. It stretches. Until it can no longer support weight. That is where the Nara Palace estate stands now. Not collapsing. Bearing less meaning with each passing decade. What once felt intentional now risks feeling incidental. This is how sacred spaces become ordinary. Not through disrespect. Through familiarity without context. The estate was designed to be read by those who knew the language of power. Orientation. Scale. Distance. Modern visitors no longer speak that language. They read landscapes differently. Through recreation, through accessibility, through personal experience. And that is not wrong. But it means the original message no longer arrives intact. One surprising historical comparison makes this clearer. In ancient Japan, silence in court was not absence of speech. It was participation. To remain silent was to acknowledge hierarchy. Silence had grammar. Today, silence is interpreted as emptiness. And emptiness invites filling. This is the quiet pressure now surrounding Nara. The pressure to add, to explain, to activate, to make it legible to a different era. But legibility comes at a price. Once you translate something fully, you decide what it means. And when you decide meaning, you eliminate alternatives. The palace estate has survived because it refused to collapse into a single story. It has been imperial, agricultural, archaeological, recreational, each layer coexisting without erasing the others. But coexistence requires balance, and balance requires intention. Here is the uncomfortable truth that planners rarely say aloud. Doing nothing is also a decision. Leaving Nara as it is, without renewed explanation, is not neutrality. It is abandonment by default. The early court abandoned the palace with purpose. Modern neglect would be abandonment without meaning. There is a difference. One preserves power. The other dissolves it. Somewhere in government archives, the original justification for restraint still exists. In memos. In meeting notes. In half-remembered traditions. But archives do not speak unless summoned. And summoning requires desire. The question now is not whether the palace should be excavated, or reconstructed, or repurposed. The real question is simpler. Does Japan still want this silence? Because silence, like speech, is a choice. If the answer is yes, then silence must be defended, explained, taught. If the answer is no, then something must replace it. Either way, the era of passive waiting is ending. The palace cannot remain a question mark forever without becoming irrelevant. That does not mean it must become an answer. It means it must become a conscious pause again. A place where restraint is chosen, not inherited blindly. This is where the story circles back to its beginning. The gates were never locked. They were forgotten. For centuries, forgetting was protection. Now, forgetting is risk. The estate does not need fences. It does not need spectacle. It needs remembrance of intent. Why it was built. Why it was left. Why it was not finished again. Without that chain of reasoning, the space becomes mute. And mute spaces are easily overwritten. The future of the Nara Palace estate will not be decided by archaeologists alone, or by officials, or by scholars. It will be decided by whether the culture still believes some places are allowed to remain unresolved, whether mystery is still seen as strength, or whether every silence must be filled. The palace once taught the nation how to stand at the center of power. Now it asks the nation how to stand with uncertainty. That is a harder lesson, but perhaps a more necessary one, because the measure of a civilization is not only what it builds, but what it chooses not to finish. The answer, in the end, will not arrive as a decision. It will arrive as a drift. History rarely turns on moments. It turns on momentum. The Nara Palace estate has survived because, for centuries, the momentum favored restraint. Not because everyone agreed, but because no one felt compelled to break the pause. That equilibrium is fragile now. Not because of malice, but because urgency has replaced patience as the default rhythm of modern life. We live in a time that values articulation, metrics, outcomes. Spaces are expected to justify themselves, and Nara resists justification. It does not teach neatly. It does not perform. It does not explain its most important absence. That resistance once aligned perfectly with Imperial philosophy. Power did not argue, it simply existed. But power today is expected to persuade. The estate was never meant to persuade anyone. It was meant to anchor, to remind the court that authority had a center, and that the center could be left behind without collapsing the world. That is its final lesson. The abandonment of Nara did not weaken Japan. It strengthened it. By leaving, the court learned mobility, adaptation, distance from its own symbols. The palace did not fall. It stepped aside. And in doing so, it became something rarer than a ruin. It became an example of intentional incompletion. This is why the site feels different from other historic places. There is no triumphant narrative here. No arc of progress. Only a decision suspended in time. To modernize, that suspension can feel uncomfortable, like an unanswered question. But unanswered questions shape civilizations as much as answers do. The problem is not that Nara has remained incomplete. The problem is that fewer people remember that incompletion was the point. Once that memory fades entirely, the estate becomes defenseless. Not physically, narratively. And narrative is where meaning lies. If future planners see only open land, they will treat it as opportunity. If future generations see only grass, they will assign it new purpose. None of that is wrong, but it will be different. And difference, once introduced, cannot be undone. The palace estate will still exist, but its role will have changed. It will no longer be a pause in history. It will be another chapter. That transition is neither good nor bad. It is simply irreversible. Which is why this moment matters. Not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because nothing dramatic is. The most consequential changes are often the quiet ones. The ones that feel reasonable, incremental, helpful. A path widened here, a sign added there, an explanation simplified for clarity, each choice understandable, each choice small, until the silence is gone. And once gone, it cannot be restored. Silence is not like architecture. You cannot rebuild it. The early court understood this. That is why they left without ceremony, without closure. They trusted future generations to understand why. Now the future has arrived, and understanding is no longer guaranteed. The Nara Palace estate stands at the edge of its long pause, not because anyone intends to end it, but because pauses require awareness. To pause deliberately is powerful. To pause unconsciously is decay. The land will not protest. It will accept whatever comes. Grass always does. The question is not what will happen to Nara. The question is what Japan wants to happen to its silences. Because once a culture decides it must explain everything, it loses the ability to leave things open. And openness was the quiet genius of this place. A capital that taught a nation how to move on without erasing itself. A center that proved power could survive by stepping away. That lesson is still here. Barely. Whether it remains as a choice still unfolding. And choices, once made without noticing, become history before anyone realizes they mattered.